Hi, my name is May, and I come from a bit of a weird family. My mom, Karen, is a single mom. She's always had to work a couple of jobs to support me, so I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house when I was growing up. Grandma's house was a paradise for a kid. She lived in the suburbs of the town in this cool little cottage that looked like something out of a fairy tale. To get to her house, you had to drive down a dirt road that crisscrossed streams and took you over mythical-looking bridges. My grandma's always been a little eccentric, but as a kid, that was the best thing I could have asked for. We'd play in the woods all day long. She'd talk to the animals as if she was having a full-on conversation with them, and sometimes it kind of seemed like she was. We'd go into her house, and she'd lay crystals out in the window and dry herbs in the rafters. She'd even let me help her make different herbal remedies for sick people in the town. For most of my childhood, everything was perfect. But then, things started getting kind of weird. Once I hit middle school, I still loved doing those things with my grandmother, but the kids in my class had started to hear about the witch that was living in the woods. I always thought the stuff she did was cool, but it seemed like everyone else thought it was nerdy and creepy. To make matters worse, pretty much everyone knew that I was with her every day after school. I started having to laugh off their taunts when they would call my grandmother a hag or evil, but deep down, it really hurt. My grandmother had practically raised me. On top of that, I started to hear weird things in the woods. At least, I thought I did. It was probably some fox or other animals calling out at night, but the sounds made me anxious. My brain scrambled them into voices of monsters, and it made me feel like I was constantly being watched. When I texted Grandma about it one morning, she showed up to pick me from school like always, but she immediately hopped out of the car and started cleansing me with herbs in front of everyone. I was absolutely mortified. All my classmates watched in mocking shock and amazement while I stood there in the cloud as my grandma rushed around me in a frenzy, chanting like a crazy person. I knew the purpose of what she was doing. She likes to use tradition and natural herbs, but I could understand why it made her look like an alien to everyone else. My classmates started taping pentagrams and other creepy stuff on my locker. I'd watch them all giggle as I tore it down. And some people even started talking about the Salem witch trials, saying they thought it was time for a second round. Honestly, I started to get scared and embarrassed. What if my grandma really was a freak? Was she rubbing off on me? Was she actually a witch? I asked my grandma to start picking me up down the street, and at first, I felt really bad about it. But as time progressed, and the taunting didn't stop, I knew I made the right choice by distancing that part of my life from my school life. Once I hit high school, I barely spent time with my grandma anymore. I was old enough to be home by myself, so she didn't need to pick me up, and I didn't need to go over at all. Around that time is where I met Jason. Jason was one of the cool kids. He always had been. And even though kids still remember me as the witch girl, it's almost like enough time had passed that they all started to forget about it. Jason was my chance to live a normal life. I felt like as soon as I became his girlfriend, people would start to like me. I would finally be cool. So when Jason invited me out, I jumped on it. He invited me to ride past curfew in a fancy car with his older friends to go egg a house. And they told me they always do it for fun. Just that was 10 times cooler than anything I had ever done. But when we turned the corner down a familiar dirt road, my heart sank. Everyone started throwing eggs at my grandmother's house, and I felt the disgust and panic set in. Jason nudged me and handed me an egg. Everyone looked at me, waiting for me to react. If I said no, if I didn't do it, would that make me the weird kid all over again? I tossed the egg and watched it splatter against the house. I instantly felt ashamed, but all the cool kids cheered and Jason grabbed my hand. The more I hung out with Jason's group, the more creepy stuff started happening around town. Weird occult symbols started showing up on banners, houses, fences. It seemed like they were everywhere. On top of that, pets were going missing almost every day. Instantly, everyone was whispering about how the witch at the edge of town was the reason, and I didn't tell them it wasn't. Could it really be my grandma? Once the cops got involved, it seemed like every day I was hearing the blame get placed on my grandma. I tried to avoid talking about it as much as possible. I started ignoring her calls. I tried to divert any conversation my classmates had away from her. I was focusing so much on avoiding it that I never could have expected what would happen during the school play. Opening night, I stepped onto the stage in the lead role and was shocked to see my grandma in the audience. Seeing my grandma and my classmates in the same room instantly made my stomach sick. As the play went on, I couldn't help but notice my classmates and even their parents glancing in her direction. When I announced the intermission, everything fell apart. People started yelling at my grandma, asking why she was taking their pets, why she was leaving her weird symbols all over town. They accused her of sacrificing the animals in some ritual. I stood with my mouth open, shocked and wounded. Could my grandma have done all that? The more the crowd yelled, the more it seemed real to me. My grandma stuttered, tears in her eyes, and asked me to tell them she wasn't a witch. All eyes turned to me, and I couldn't do it. In a meek, broken voice, I asked, "Why are you doing this? Why do you have to be such a creep?" In a whirlwind, she ran out of the theater, and I felt my heart sink. Had I really done that to her? But really, she was the only logical explanation. If I hadn't said anything, would everyone have thought I was in on it? The rest of the play was canceled, and I went home. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I just felt empty and bitter inside. A few days passed, and my mother told me that Grandma was moving out of town. She thought it would be best for her. I couldn't help but feel the entire thing was my fault. Guilt I felt was so overwhelming. So I decided to go to Jason's late one night and talk it out with him. Maybe we could come up with a plan to stop her. A plan to make the townspeople like her. When I arrived at Jason's place, I saw a light coming from the storage room, which was behind Jason's room. So I thought that he may be there. I went to the window and looked up. I couldn't believe my eyes. The room was filled with many different cages with animals, the same ones that were missing from all around town. Jason noticed my presence and rushed to me, afraid and flustered, trying to explain everything. I didn't want to hear anything from him. When he realized I wasn't going to listen or forgive, he got mean. As I walked away, he swore he would make me the weird kid again. No one would talk to me, and on top of that, he was going to frame my grandma, and I knew he could. I realized I needed to come up with a plan of my own. I turned around and stood my ground. I took out my phone and hit record. I streamed live to everybody, calling Jason out for pinning his actions on an old woman, for betraying my trust. Person after person joined, disgusted by him. But I soon became disgusted with myself. "You put the final nail in your grandma's coffin," Jason yelled at me. Jason was right. I had gotten into the mob mentality. I had demonized my own grandma and pretended I didn't like something that I loved just because other people didn't understand it. I stopped the stream and raced over to my grandma's. When I got there, I found her packing up the final items in her house. I begged her to stay. I told her I loved everything about her. I didn't think she was creepy. I had been trying to fit in with people who weren't worth my time and didn't understand me. I begged for her forgiveness, and she instantly took me in her arms. She let me cry on her shoulder as I apologized, and she completely accepted it. She told me she knew I would be back. When I asked her how, she winked over her shoulder and said, "I saw it in my crystal ball." Have you been in a similar situation where you hurt someone because you were trying to fit in? How's your relationship with your grandma? Tell me more in the comment section below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.